Do you ever wonder how medieval rulers kept power over lands stretching for thousands of miles? How did knights get people to follow them into bloody battles for years on end? How did the church convince millions to believe in its every word during the period from the 5th to the 15th centuries? Number 10. Vilification of enemies. In the medieval world, shaping public opinion about opponents was a powerful tool. It was not enough to defeat an enemy on the battlefield. One also had to defeat their reputation in the minds of the people. This technique involved spreading stories, crafting narratives, and creating images that portrayed rivals as inherently evil, treacherous, or even inhuman. This turned a political or territorial dispute into a moral crusade, making it easier to rally support and justify harsh actions. It tapped into people's deepest fears and prejudices. One powerful example of this technique involved the perception of the other during the Crusades. When European Christian armies set out to reclaim the Holy Land, it was important to paint a clear picture of their Muslim adversaries. Chroniclers and preachers described Muslims as infidels, heathens, and enemies of God. They were often portrayed as cruel, barbarous, and even devil worshippers, despite the complex and often sophisticated cultures that existed in the Islamic world. Peter the Hermit, a key figure in inspiring the First Crusade, traveled through France and Germany, speaking with fervent passion. He described the supposed atrocities committed against Christian pilgrims in Jerusalem, exaggerating and distorting accounts to ignite outrage. He spoke of desecrated churches and suffering Christians, making the journey to the Holy Land seem like a divine duty of revenge and liberation. These narratives were not simply factual reports. They were carefully constructed stories meant to evoke strong emotional responses. Songs and poems also spread these images. Bards would sing tales of Muslim brutality, reinforcing the idea that violence against them was not only justified, but necessary. Knights who returned from the East often brought back exaggerated tales of their own, further solidifying these negative stereotypes. This constant flow of negative information about Muslims helped to unite disparate European lords and commoners under a shared banner, framing their military expeditions as righteous holy wars. Another powerful instance of vilification played out during the conflicts between England and France, particularly during the 100 Years' War. Joan of Arc, a French peasant girl who claimed divine guidance and led French forces to victories, became a symbol of French resistance and hope. To the English, however, she represented a dangerous threat to their claims on the French throne. The English and their Burgundian allies sought to discredit her completely. They did not simply argue against her military prowess, they attacked her character and her spiritual claims. She was accused of witchcraft, heresy, and dressing like a man, all serious transgressions in the medieval mind. English propaganda aimed to strip her of her divine authority and turn her into a tool of the devil. The trial of Joan of Arc in Rouen was a highly publicized event, meticulously documented by her accusers. The proceedings were designed to prove her guilt and invalidate her legitimacy as a leader. Priests and theologians examined her visions and actions, twisting them to fit charges of heresy. By declaring her a witch and a heretic, the English not only neutralized a powerful enemy leader, but also sought to undermine the morale of the French people who believed in her. Her execution in 1431 was intended as a final blow, a public spectacle designed to show the consequences of defying the established order, religious and political. The vilification was so thorough that even after her death for a time, her image remained tainted in English eyes, while the French eventually rehabilitated her. The vilification of Jewish communities across medieval Europe serves as another tragic example. Throughout the medieval period, Jewish people were often accused of various heinous acts, including ritual murder, host desecration, and poisoning wells. These accusations, known as blood libels, spread like wildfire through towns and villages. They were fueled by sermons from preachers, popular songs, and local gossip. In 1255, in Lincoln, England, the story of Little St. Hugh emerged. A young Christian boy was found dead, and immediately the local Jewish community was blamed for his death. The narrative claimed the boy had been crucified by Jews as a ritual sacrifice. This story, entirely baseless, led to the arrest and execution of many Jewish people in Lincoln. It became a template for similar accusations across Europe. During the Black Death in the mid-14th century, when a devastating plague swept across the continent, fear and desperation led to widespread accusations that Jewish people had poisoned wells to cause the disease. This was a particularly cruel and effective form of vilification, turning an unimaginable natural catastrophe into an opportunity to scapegoat a vulnerable minority. These accusations, though demonstrably false, were powerful because they played on existing prejudices and fears, providing a simple, albeit horrifying, explanation for complex problems. The result was widespread persecution, massacres, and expulsions of Jewish communities from various European states, such as England in 1290 and France in 1394. The continuous negative portrayal through sermons, passion plays, and even children's rhymes created a deeply entrenched prejudice that survived for centuries. Monarchs also used vilification against their rivals for the throne. When William the Conqueror invaded England in 1066, he presented himself as the rightful heir to the English throne, claiming Edward the Confessor had promised it to him. His opponent, Harold Godwinson, was portrayed as a perjurer and a usurper who had broken his oath to William. Norman chroniclers depicted Harold as an oath-breaker who seized the crown against God's will. Pope Alexander II lent weight to William's claim by sending a papal banner suggesting divine approval for the invasion and implicitly condemning Harold. After William's victory at the Battle of Hastings, this narrative was further solidified. The Bayeux Tapestry, a massive embroidered cloth depicting the events leading up to the Norman conquest, visually reinforces this message. Harold is shown swearing an oath to William over holy relics and then later being crowned, highlighting his broken promise. By painting Harold as a faithless oath-breaker, William ensured his conquest was viewed not just as a military victory, but as a restoration of justice and divine order. This helped to legitimize his rule in the eyes of the English and European nobility. In the intricate dance of power between popes and emperors, vilification was also a common weapon. During the investiture controversy in the 11th and 12th centuries, which centered on who had the authority to appoint bishops, Pope Gregory VII and Emperor Henry IV engaged in a fierce battle of words and images. Gregory VII excommunicated Henry IV, declaring him unfit to rule and releasing his subjects from their oaths of loyalty. Portrayed Henry as a wicked tyrant, an enemy of the Church, and a disobedient son of God. Henry, in turn, gathered his own bishops and declared Gregory a false monk and a usurper of the papacy. Pamphlets and letters were circulated, each side painting the other in the darkest possible light. Gregory's supporters emphasized Henry's personal failings and impious actions, while Henry's partisans highlighted Gregory's perceived arrogance and overreach of papal power. The goal was to undermine the legitimacy of the opponent and rally support from the clergy and nobility. The vilification was so intense that it led to open warfare and decades of instability across the Holy Roman Empire and Italy. The mutual demonization aimed to deny the opponent any moral ground, making compromise appear impossible and escalating the conflict. The technique of vilification created clear divisions, turning complex situations into stark battles between good and evil. It allowed rulers and religious authorities to justify actions that might otherwise be questioned, from warfare to persecution. By stripping opponents of their humanity or legitimacy, it made it easier for people to accept their downfall, contributing to the stability of the victor's power. Number 9. Public spectacles and feasts. Medieval rulers understood the power of a grand display. Public spectacles and elaborate feasts were not simply forms of entertainment. They were carefully orchestrated events designed to showcase wealth, power, and generosity, reinforcing the monarch's authority and creating a sense of shared identity and loyalty among the populace. These events created a direct sensory experience of royal majesty. Tournaments and jousts were among the most popular spectacles. Knights, often the very elite of the nobility, would engage in mock combat, demonstrating their martial prowess, bravery, and chivalry. A royal tournament was an immensely expensive undertaking, requiring vast preparations. Elaborate pavilions were erected, often decorated with the coats of arms of participating nobles. Sumptuous banquets accompanied these events, and minstrels sang songs of heroic deeds. The sheer scale of the event, the dazzling armor, the thundering hooves, and the skill of the combatants all served to impress the onlookers. For the common people, who might only see their monarch from afar on rare occasions, these tournaments offered a thrilling glimpse into the world of the powerful. They saw the king or a great lord as the patron of such events, the one who orchestrated this display of strength and honor. For instance, the Round Table tournaments held by King Edward III of England in the 14th century were not just games. They were deliberate attempts to rekindle the spirit of Arthurian chivalry, to project an image of a glorious heroic monarchy, and to unite his nobility under his banner, especially during the early stages of the 100 Years' War. These spectacles also served as training grounds for knights, and a way to gauge the military strength of one's vassals. King's presence presiding over the contests affirmed his position as the ultimate authority and source of honor in the realm. The cheers of the crowd, the excitement of the competition, and the shared experience created a collective sense of pride and allegiance to the crown. Coronations and royal entries into cities were perhaps the most significant public spectacles. A monarch's coronation was a sacred and political event, a fusion of religious ritual and secular power. Procession through the streets, the anointing with holy oil, the crowning, and the enthronement within a cathedral were all designed to emphasize the monarch's divine right to rule. Crowds would line the streets, eager to witness the new king or queen. The regalia, the crown, scepter, and orb were powerful symbols of authority. When Henry II of England was crowned in 1154, the ceremony at Westminster Abbey was a meticulously planned affair. The sight of the archbishop placing the crown on his head, amidst prayers and acclamations, solidified his claim to the throne. His entry into London afterwards would have involved lavish decorations, triumphal arches, and gifts distributed to the populace. Similarly, when a king made a royal entry into a major city, it was a carefully choreographed procession. The city gates would be decorated, bells would peal, and citizens would line the streets, often with guilds performing pageants or plays that celebrated the monarch. These entries allowed the king to be seen by large numbers of his subjects, creating a personal connection and reinforcing his presence and power across his domains. Pomp and ceremony underscored the idea that the monarch was above ordinary people, chosen by God, and the embodiment of the realm itself. Feasts, especially those held for large numbers of people, were another vital component of medieval public relations. King's ability to host a lavish feast with abundant food, fine wines, and entertainment was a clear demonstration of his wealth and resources. The more guests he could feed and entertain, the greater his perceived power and generosity. These banquets often followed important events, like coronations, victories, or diplomatic gatherings. When Louis IX of France hosted a large feast for his nobles and knights, it was not merely a social gathering, it was an opportunity to foster loyalty, dispense patronage, and solidify alliances. The sheer volume of food, the variety of dishes, and the presence of musicians, jesters, and storytellers all contributed to an atmosphere of abundance and celebration. Serving thousands of guests required immense logistical planning, touting the king's organization capabilities and the resources at his command. Such feasts often lasted for days, allowing for networking and the forging of relationships among the elite, all under the watchful eye and patronage of the monarch. The generosity of the king was expected, and it reinforced his image as a provider and protector of his people. Public executions and punishments, while grim, also served as spectacles. Though different in nature from celebratory events, they too were public displays of authority and justice. The condemned criminal, rebel, or heretic was displayed, their fate serving as a stark warning to anyone contemplating defiance of royal or ecclesiastical law. The scaffold was a stage, and the executioner a grim actor. When rebels were hung, drawn, and quartered in England, it was a brutal but public demonstration of the crown's power to crush dissent and maintain order. The spectacle of punishment reinforced the idea that disobedience carried severe consequences. This was not about entertainment in the same way a tournament was, but about instilling fear and respect for the law and the ruler who enforced it. Public nature of these events ensured that the message was widely disseminated and understood. Religious festivals and processions, though primarily spiritual, also served a political purpose. The church, often closely aligned with the monarchy, orchestrated grand processions on feast days, displaying relics and religious banners. These events brought communities together, reinforcing shared beliefs and values. When a bishop or a king led a procession through a town, it was a demonstration of both spiritual and temporal authority. The display of religious relics, believed to hold divine power, awe-inspired the faithful and reinforced the church's role as a conduit for divine favor. Pilgrimages to holy sites, often encouraged by the church and sometimes even rulers, were massive undertakings that brought people together, fostering shared experiences and reinforcing the religious and social order. The spectacle of hundreds or thousands of pilgrims moving towards a common sacred goal created a powerful sense of community and shared purpose. All these public spectacles, whether joyful or grim, served to reinforce the power structures of the medieval world. They created memorable experiences that helped to shape perceptions, foster loyalty, and maintain order. They were visual and sensory lessons in who held power and what it meant to be part of the community under that power. Number 8. Historiography and chronicling. In the medieval period, history was not simply a recounting of past events. It was a powerful tool used to shape the present and legitimize future actions. Chroniclers, scribes, and historians, often working under the patronage of kings, nobles, or the church, carefully selected and presented information to create narratives that favored their patrons. These written accounts, whether large tomes or shorter annals, became the official versions of events, shaping how future generations understood the past and reinforcing the power of the ruling elite. One of the most significant examples of this technique is the work of Anglo-Norman chroniclers after the Norman conquest of England in 1066. William the Conqueror, a foreign invader, needed to establish his legitimacy and the right of his new dynasty to rule England. Chroniclers like William of Poitiers, who served William, played a crucial role in this. William of Poitiers, Gesta Guilmi Ducus Normanorum et Regis Anglorum. The deeds of William, Duke of the Normans and King of the English, portrayed William as a righteous conqueror, chosen by God, and fulfilling a divine plan. Harold Godwinson, the defeated English king, was depicted as a usurper and an oath-breaker. The narrative emphasized Harold's supposed broken promise to William regarding the succession and the blessing William received from the Pope. This account was not just a historical record. It was a justification for the brutal conquest and the subsequent subjugation of the Anglo-Saxon elite. It helped to solidify the Norman claim to the English throne and shape the perception of the new ruling class as legitimate. Later chroniclers like Orderic Vitalis, while more critical at times, still largely adhered to this Norman-centric view, ensuring that the official history of England was told from the perspective of its new rulers. The writing of such histories was a way to control the narrative, ensuring that the legacy of the conquerors was one of justice and divine right. The Church also extensively used historiography to assert its authority and promote its saints and doctrines. Ecclesiastical histories, such as Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People, written in the 8th century, were not just records of the Church's development. Bede, a monk from Northumbria, aimed to demonstrate the growth and triumph of Christianity in England, particularly the Roman form over Celtic traditions. He carefully selected stories of miracles, pious kings, and devoted saints to illustrate divine favor for the Roman Church and the Anglo-Saxon rulers who embraced it. His history presented a clear lineage of Christian kings, emphasizing their piety and their role in spreading the faith. This helped to solidify the idea of England as a Christian nation under the guidance of the Roman Church and served to legitimize the rule of Christian monarchs. The stories of saints, often collected in hagiographies, were another form of historical writing. These accounts of holy lives, miracles, and martyrdoms, like those in the Golden Legend by Jacobus de Varagen, were immensely popular. They were not strictly historical in the modern sense, but aimed to inspire faith and devotion, often promoting specific saints and their cults, which in turn brought pilgrims and wealth to particular shrines and churches. These narratives reinforced the power of the Church and its ability to mediate between the earthly and divine realms. Monarchs frequently commissioned official court historians to produce chronicles that glorified their reigns. Charlemagne, the powerful Frankish king and Holy Roman Emperor, employed scholars to record his achievements. The royal Frankish annals served as a primary source for his reign, meticulously detailing his military campaigns, his expansion of the empire, and his interactions with the Pope. While purporting to be factual, these annals often omitted defeats or downplayed setbacks, focusing instead on his successes and his image as a divinely appointed leader who restored the Roman Empire. These records were intended to be read by future generations of rulers and nobles, providing a narrative of uninterrupted success and rightful authority. Similarly, French kings commissioned chroniclers to record their deeds. Jean Froissart, a 14th century chronicler, documented the early phases of the 100 Years' War. While his work provides invaluable insights, it often reflects the biases and perspectives of his patrons, particularly the English and various French noble houses, shaping the perception of events for his audience. His descriptions of chivalry and heroic deeds served to elevate the status of the warrior class and the rulers they served. The development of dynastic histories was also crucial. Noble families and royal houses would commission genealogies and histories that traced their lineage back to ancient heroes, saints, or even biblical figures. This provided a historical justification for their claims to land, titles, and power. The legendary history of King Arthur, for example, was embraced by several medieval monarchs, particularly in Britain. Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britanniae, History of the Kings of Britain, written in the 12th century, provided a fictionalized but highly influential account of British kings from ancient times to the Anglo-Saxon conquest. This work, though lacking historical accuracy, created a powerful mythic past for Britain, which English monarchs, like Edward I, later tried to appropriate to bolster their authority over Wales and Scotland by claiming a historical supremacy rooted in Arthurian. The narrative established a long, glorious, and unbroken line of British kings. Even if much of it was invention, writing history was an act of power. It determined what was remembered, how it was remembered, and whose achievements were celebrated. By controlling the narrative of the past, medieval rulers and religious institutions could legitimize their present power, justify their actions, and secure their legacy for the future. The chroniclers and historians were not neutral observers. They were active participants in shaping the historical memory of their age, crafting stories that reinforce the prevailing order and the authority of their patrons. These written accounts, disseminated through copies made by scribes in monasteries and scriptoria, provided a lasting record that served to reinforce the prevailing power structures for generations. Number 7. Sainthood and relic. Cults. In the medieval world, the power of sainthood and the veneration of relics were not just spiritual practices. They were incredibly effective tools for influence, legitimacy, and wealth. Saints were seen as intermediaries between God and humanity, and their relics, physical remains or objects associated with them, were believed to possess miraculous powers. Promotion of a saint or a collection of relics could draw pilgrims, generate revenue, establish a center of power, and legitimize a ruler or an institution. The cult of Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, murdered in 1170, is a prime example of a saint's immense influence. Following his assassination by knights loyal to King Henry II of England, Becket was almost immediately hailed as a martyr. The Church acted quickly to canonize him, declaring him a saint. His tomb at Canterbury Cathedral became one of the most important pilgrimage sites in Europe. The stories of miracles occurring at his tomb spread rapidly. People claimed to be cured of illnesses, blindness, and lameness after visiting his shrine or touching objects associated with him. These stories, widely disseminated by clergy and pilgrims, transformed a controversial political figure into a powerful spiritual icon. The steady stream of pilgrims brought enormous wealth to Canterbury, making it a powerful ecclesiastical center for King Henry II. Becket's murder was a major setback. His subsequent penance at Becket's tomb, where he allowed himself to be scourged by monks, was a public act of humility and a clear acknowledgement of the saint's power, a way for the king to relegitimize himself in the eyes of a deeply religious populace. The enduring popularity of Becket's cult demonstrated the Church's ability to create a powerful narrative around martyrdom and use it to assert its spiritual authority even over a powerful monarch. Relics were at the heart of medieval piety and power. Churches, monasteries, and cathedrals vied to acquire the most prestigious relics, as their possession attracted pilgrims and their donations. The Cathedral of St. Denis near Paris, for instance, became a major pilgrimage site due to its extensive collection of relics, including those of its patron Saint Dionysius. Abbot Suger, who oversaw its reconstruction in the 12th century, deliberately enhanced the display of these relics. He believed that the splendor of the church filled with precious objects and relics would elevate the spiritual experience of the worshipper and reflect the glory of God. This also served to legitimize the French monarchy, as Saint Denis was the royal abbey, the burial place of French kings. The relics of Saint Denis, therefore, intertwined deeply with the legitimacy of the Capetian dynasty. Possessing powerful relics was seen as a sign of divine favor, reinforcing the legitimacy of both the church institution and its royal patrons. Rulers sometimes even carried relics into battle, believing they offered divine protection and guaranteed victory, further linking military success to religious piety. Crusades themselves were deeply intertwined with the cult of relics. The very objective of the First Crusade was to reclaim the holiest relic for Christians, the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, the site of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection. Relics of the true cross, believed to be fragments of the cross on which Jesus was crucified, were highly prized. Their discovery, or supposed discovery, often led to great fervor. The story of Emperor Heraclius recovering the true cross from the Persians in the 7th century was a powerful narrative that inspired later crusaders. During the Fourth Crusade, the sack of Constantinople in 1204 led to the plunder of countless precious relics, which were then distributed among various European churches. While this was an act of violence, the acquisition of these relics was seen by the recipients as a divine blessing and a significant boost to their spiritual authority and prestige. For example, The Doge of Venice famously brought back the relics of Saint Mark the Evangelist from Alexandria, making Saint Mark the patron saint of Venice and legitimizing the city's growing power and independence. Creation of new saints was a process often influenced by political and social considerations. Royal saints, for example, were kings or queens who were canonized. Their sainthood often served to elevate their entire dynasty. King Edward, the Confessor of England, canonized in the 12th century, became a patron saint of England. His cult, promoted by later English monarchs, provided a historical and spiritual link to previous kings, reinforcing the continuity and legitimacy of the English monarchy. By claiming descent from or association with a saintly predecessor, a king could enhance his own divine mandate and secure the loyalty of the subjects. Construction of magnificent shrines and cathedrals dedicated to these saints further solidified their importance and drew more pilgrims, bringing both spiritual prestige and economic benefit to the region. Local saints also played a significant role in fostering regional identity and loyalty. Towns and villages often had their own local saints whose relics and cults were promoted by local lords or bishops. These saints were believed to protect the community, cure illnesses, and answer prayers. The annual feast days of these local saints became important communal events, fostering a sense of shared identity and belonging. The promotion of these saints was not just a religious act, it was a way to strengthen local power structures and bring people together under a shared spiritual banner. The competition between different churches and monasteries for the most revered relics was intense, as the spiritual prestige translated directly into material wealth through pilgrims' offerings and donations. The sheer effort and expense put into acquiring housing and promoting relics demonstrate their perceived power. The belief in the power of saints and relics provided a profound emotional and spiritual connection for medieval people. By controlling the narrative around saints and relics, medieval institutions and rulers could tap into this deep faith, influencing beliefs, directing large movements of people, and consolidating their authority in a world where spiritual legitimacy was paramount. The stories of miraculous cures, divine interventions, and saintly intercession were not just tales. They were central to the belief system that underpinned the power of the Church and those monarchs who aligned themselves with it. Number 6. Coinage and seals. In a world without mass media, coins and seals served as ubiquitous carriers of images and messages, reaching almost everyone who handled currency or official documents. They were miniature billboards, constantly reinforcing the authority of the ruler or institution that issued them. The symbols, portraits, and inscriptions on coins and seals were carefully chosen to convey specific ideas about power, legitimacy, and identity. Coins were perhaps the most widely circulated form of visual propaganda. Every time a person made a transaction, they encountered the image of the ruler. On one side, coins often featured the king's profile or bust, sometimes stylized, sometimes attempting a more realistic portrait. This served as a constant reminder of who held supreme authority in the realm. For example, Byzantine emperors like Justinian I in the 6th century often appeared on their coins with halos, emphasizing their divine favor and sacred authority. Later, emperors like Charlemagne, despite his efforts to restore the Roman Empire, adopted a more restrained classical profile on his coins, subtly linking his rule to the grandeur of ancient Rome. The sheer act of handling currency with the ruler's image embedded in it reinforced his omnipresence and control over the economy. Purity of the metal and the consistent weight of the coin also implicitly communicated the stability and trustworthiness of the monarch's rule. A debased coinage with less precious metal often indicated a ruler in financial distress or one who was untrustworthy, undermining public confidence. The reverse side of medieval coins often carried symbols, religious motifs, or coats of arms. These images conveyed important messages about the ruler's values, alliances, or claims to territory. For example, during the Crusades, some coins minted in the Crusader states featured religious symbols like the Holy Cross, signifying the sacred nature of their enterprise. English coins often featured the cross and pellets, later developing into the royal coat of arms, with the 3 lions passant guardant, representing the Plantagenet dynasty's claims to the English throne and later, through the addition of the French fleur-de-lis, their claims to the French crown. These visual cues were understood by people regardless of their literacy, reinforcing the king's territorial claims and his connection to the realm's heritage. The choice of imagery was deliberate, aimed at shaping perceptions and fostering loyalty. Even small changes in coin design could signal a new reign, a new policy, or a shift in focus. The widespread circulation of these coins meant that these symbols and messages reached every corner of the kingdom, from the bustling markets of cities to the remote villages, constantly reminding everyone of the source of legitimate power. Seals, though less widely circulated than coins, held immense importance in legal and administrative contexts. Every official document, charter, or letter from a king, a great noble, or a bishop required a seal to authenticate it. Without a seal, a document had no legal standing. These seals were typically made of wax, impressed from a metal matrix and attached to the parchment. The designs on seals were often more elaborate than those on coins, given their larger size. Royal seals commonly depicted the monarch enthroned, holding symbols of authority like an orb and scepter, reinforcing their majesty and judicial power. Sometimes, the king would be shown on horseback in full armor, representing his martial prowess and ability to defend the realm. For example, the Great Seal of Edward III of England showed him enthroned on one side and on horseback, in full armor on the other. This duality presented the king as both a wise ruler of justice and a powerful military leader. Ecclesiastical seals were equally important, used by bishops, abbots, and papal legates to authenticate their decrees and correspondence. These seals often featured images of the saint to whom their cathedral or monastery was dedicated, or symbols of their office, such as a crozier and mitre. Papal seals, known as bulli, featured the heads of Saints Peter and Paul on one side and the Pope's name on the other, symbolizing the apostolic authority of the papacy. These seals carried the weight of religious authority, ensuring that papal pronouncements were received with solemn respect across the Christian world. The visual elements on these seals communicated the source of authority, whether temporal or spiritual, and the legitimacy of the document it authenticated. A document without a proper seal was instantly suspect, highlighting the trust placed in these small but powerful objects. Nobles also had their own seals, displaying their family coat of arms, often with elaborate heraldic devices. These seals were used to authenticate their own charters, deeds, and letters, signifying their personal authority and lineage within their lands. The design of a noble's seal was a visual representation of their identity, their family history, and their place within the feudal hierarchy. The widespread use of seals created a visual language of power and legitimacy, recognized and respected by all. Forging a seal was a serious crime, punishable by death, underscoring the vital role seals played in maintaining order and trust in administrative and legal systems. Creation and control of coinage and seals were monopolies of power. Only legitimate authorities could mint coins or issue seals that would be accepted. Counterfeiting or unauthorized use of seals was a direct challenge to authority, demonstrating how essential these tools were to the functioning of medieval governance. Through these small, tangible objects, medieval rulers and institutions projected their authority into the daily lives of their subjects, shaping their understanding of who was in charge and what it meant to live under their rule. The consistent repetition of these visual messages day after day, year after year, contributed to the stability and longevity of medieval power structures. They were silent, but ever-present reminders of the established order. Number 5. Architecture and monumental art. Medieval architecture, particularly cathedrals, castles, and public buildings was not merely functional. It was a grand statement, a physical embodiment of power, piety, and the prevailing social order. These monumental structures, often adorned with intricate sculpture, vibrant stained glass, and majestic frescoes, communicated complex messages to an overwhelmingly illiterate population. They shaped people's perceptions of authority and the divine. Cathedrals stood as the supreme examples of ecclesiastical power and faith. Their immense scale, soaring spires, and intricate designs inspired awe and humility. The construction of a great cathedral, often spanning centuries, was an enormous undertaking, requiring immense resources, skilled labor, and sustained patronage from bishops, kings, and wealthy nobles. Chartres Cathedral in France, for example, with its magnificent stained glass windows, told biblical stories to a populace that could not read the Bible. Each window depicted scenes from the Old and New Testaments, lives of saints or allegories, guiding the illiterate worshiper through the narrative of salvation. The sculptures adorning the portals, like the royal portal at Chartres, depicted Christ in majesty, prophets and saints, reinforcing the spiritual hierarchy and the Church's role as the gateway to salvation. The sheer height of the nave reaching towards the heavens was designed to elevate the human spirit and emphasize God's omnipotence. These buildings were physical manifestations of divine power and the Church's authority on earth, inviting people to believe and submit. The donation of stained glass windows or altars by powerful nobles or guilds within these cathedrals also served to publicly display their piety and social standing. The visible presence of these grand structures in the heart of cities or towns served as a constant reminder of the Church's enduring presence and influence over daily life. Castles, the residences and strongholds of secular rulers and powerful lords, were equally potent symbols of power and control. A massive stone castle, with its thick walls, imposing towers, and defensive features like moats and battlements, projected an unmistakable image of military strength and invulnerability. These fortresses were designed to deter attackers and provide a secure base from which a lord could control his territory. Construction of a castle like the Norman castles in England after 1066, such as Dover Castle, was a clear declaration of dominance. These structures were not just defensive, they were instruments of control. They overlooked the surrounding lands, serving as constant visual reminders of the Lord's presence and authority. The sheer cost and labor involved in building a castle also demonstrated the Lord's wealth and ability to command resources. Inside the Great Hall often served as a place for dispensing justice, holding feasts, and receiving vassals, reinforcing the Lord's role as judge, provider, and protector. The display of armaments, banners, and hunting trophies within the castle further accentuated the Lord's power and status. The very existence of such a formidable structure made clear who was in charge and who held the power to enforce laws and collect taxes. Town halls and other civic buildings, especially in later medieval cities, also communicated messages about urban identity and civic power. As cities grew in wealth and autonomy, they began to construct impressive town halls, guild halls, and belfries. These buildings, often adorned with civic symbols or statues of local heroes, expressed the collective pride and independence of the urban community. Construction of a grand belfry, a tower housing bells that regulated the city's daily life and sounded alarms, symbolized the city's self-governance and economic prosperity. The display of the city's coat of arms or civic symbols on these buildings fostered a sense of communal identity and loyalty among the citizens. These structures conveyed a message of local pride and collective power, sometimes even subtly challenging the authority of the local lord or king. The decorative elements of architecture were also crucial. Frescoes painted on church walls depicted scenes from the Bible, the lives of saints, or the Last Judgment, serving as powerful visual sermons for the congregation. Tapestries hanging in castles and noble residences often depicted historical battles, mythological tales, or heraldic designs, reinforcing the owner's lineage and martial virtues. Stained glass, particularly in churches, not only illuminated the interior, but also presented narratives in a dazzling array of colors, drawing the eye and conveying religious instruction. The choice of biblical scenes or patron saints to be depicted in a church's artwork was often strategic, reflecting the theological priorities of the commissioning bishop or the spiritual needs of the local community. For example, scenes of Christ's triumph or images of fearsome devils in Last Judgment frescoes served to instill both hope and fear, guiding moral behavior. Even bridges and city walls served as monumental statements. Building a sturdy bridge over a difficult river crossing was a feat of engineering that displayed a ruler's or community's wealth and organization capability. City walls, though primarily defensive, were also imposing structures that visually defined the boundaries of a city and symbolized its strength and independence. The very scale and permanence of these structures were messages in themselves. They were built to last for generations, a testament to the enduring power of those who commissioned them and the beliefs they represented. Constant presence of these grand, well-built structures shaped the daily lives and worldviews of medieval people, reinforcing the ideas of hierarchy, faith, and authority. Number 4. Storytelling and oral tradition. Long before the printing press, the spoken word and handcrafted narratives were powerful tools for shaping public opinion, inspiring loyalty, and even provoking action. Storytelling, through ballads, epic poems, legends, and the performances of troubadours and minstrels, was a primary means of mass communication. These narratives conveyed moral lessons, celebrated heroes, demonized enemies, and reinforced social values, reaching an audience that was largely illiterate. Epic poems and chansons de geste, like the Song of Roland, were central to this tradition. The Song of Roland, a French epic poem from the 11th century, recounts the Battle of Roncesvalles Pass, where Charlemagne's rearguard, led by the heroic Roland, is ambushed by Basques, though in the poem they are depicted as Saracens or Muslims. The poem glorifies Christian martyrdom, loyalty to one's liege lord, Charlemagne, and the idea of a holy war against infidels. Roland's defiant stand, his refusal to blow his Oliphant horn for help until it was too late, and his ultimate death for the Christian cause made him an enduring symbol of chivalry and religious zeal. This story, performed by jongleurs, itinerant entertainers, in castles and public squares, served to inspire knights to bravery, instill loyalty to their king, and foster a sense of shared Christian identity against non-Christian enemies. The repeated performance of such tales ingrained their values and heroes into the collective consciousness, shaping the ideals of the warrior class and providing a narrative framework for conflicts like the Crusades. The audience would hear how Roland's sword Durendal contained holy relics, further linking his heroism to divine will. Arthurian legends, particularly those centered around King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, were another hugely influential body of stories. While entirely mythical, these tales, popularized by writers like Chrétien de Troyes in the 12th century and later by Sir Thomas Malory in the 15th century, created an idealized vision of kingship, chivalry, and noble conduct. Arthur was portrayed as a just and wise king, surrounded by brave and virtuous knights. The stories of their quests, their devotion to honor, and their search for the Holy Grail resonated deeply with the nobility and common people alike. English monarchs, notably Edward I, attempted to link themselves to the Arthurian legacy to legitimize their rule and inspire loyalty, even holding their own round table tournaments. Popularity of these stories fostered a sense of national pride and provided a moral compass, emphasizing virtues like courage, loyalty, and justice. They created a shared cultural heritage that transcended regional differences, uniting people under a common set of ideals embodied by the legendary king. Troubadours and minstrels were crucial disseminators of these stories and more contemporary news. These traveling performers composed and sang ballads about current events, heroic deeds, scandals, and political rivalries. They were the medieval equivalent of news broadcasters and celebrity gossips, reaching audiences in castles, monasteries, and marketplaces. A lord might commission a minstrel to compose a song praising his military victory or denouncing his rival. These songs, easily memorized and spread, could quickly shape public opinion. For instance, after a major battle, a minstrel might perform a ballad glorifying the victorious lord and subtly ridiculing the defeated one, solidifying the narrative of victory and bolstering the victor's prestige. During periods of political tension, rumors and accusations could be woven into seemingly innocuous songs, spreading dissent or support under the guise of entertainment. The very act of singing and performing created an emotional connection with the audience, making the message more memorable and everyday. The ability of these oral traditions to bypass literacy barriers meant their reach was vast and pervasive. Religious narratives were also spread through storytelling, particularly in sermons and miracle plays. Priests would tell stories of saints' lives, miracles, and parables from the Bible, often embellishing them to make them more engaging and able. These sermons were delivered in the vernacular, making them accessible to everyone in the congregation. Miracle plays performed in town squares or churchyards dramatized biblical stories or the lives of saints. These performances, vivid and often emotional, brought sacred narratives to life, teaching moral lessons and reinforcing Christian doctrine in a way that resonated with common people. For example, a play depicting the suffering of a martyr could instill piety and a willingness to endure hardship for faith. These public performances were not just entertainment. They were powerful tools for religious instruction and the reinforcement of spiritual authority. The spread of rumors and gossip also formed a powerful, albeit uncontrolled, oral tradition. In communities where information traveled slowly, rumors could quickly take on a life of their own, spreading fear, suspicion, or excitement. Carefully planted rumor about a lord's cruelty, a king's weakness, or a rival's treachery could undermine their authority without any direct accusation. While not propaganda, in the commissioned sense, the ability of oral traditions to carry and amplify such informal narratives made them a potent, if unpredictable, force in shaping public opinion. Medieval society relied heavily on word of mouth, making the spoken story and shared narrative fundamental to how people understood their world, their leaders, and their place within the social fabric. These stories, whether heroic epics or cautionary tales, shaped collective memory and values, influencing behavior and loyalty across generations. Number 3. Symbolism and iconography. In a world where most people could not read, visual symbols were vital. From the banners fluttering above castles to the intricate designs on a knight's shield, medieval society was saturated with powerful iconography that conveyed identity, allegiance, and authority. These symbols were immediately recognizable, communicating complex ideas in a universal visual language that transcended literacy. They instilled loyalty, pride, and sometimes fear. Heraldry, the system of coats of arms and armorial bearings, is perhaps the most iconic example of medieval symbolism. Coat of arms typically displayed on a knight's shield, banner, and surcoat identified individuals, families, and even nations. These designs, with their specific colors, animals, and geometric patterns, were not just decorative. They represented lineage, achievements, and claims to power. The three lions, passant guardant, for example, became the enduring symbol of the English monarchy from Richard I onwards. Whenever this symbol appeared on a banner, a seal, or a knight's shield, it immediately declared the presence or authority of the King of England. For the common soldier or peasant, seeing their lord's banner flying high in battle or over a castle wall provided a rallying point and a clear statement of who they served. The distinctiveness of each noble family's arms helped to define the complex web of feudal relationships. When a lord displayed his arms, it was a public declaration of his identity, his lineage, and his feudal allegiance, or sometimes his independence. The visual unity of an army under a single banner was a powerful message of cohesion and loyalty, making the sight of a king's banner both inspiring to his followers and intimidating to his enemies. Religious iconography also played a dominant role. The cross, in its many forms, was the most universal symbol of Christianity. Displayed on churches, worn by pilgrims, and emblazoned on the tunics of crusaders, it immediately conveyed faith and allegiance to the church. The chi-rho symbol, an early Christian monogram for Christ, was used by Constantine the Great, linking his imperial authority to divine favor. Images of saints, often with specific attributes that identified them, e.g., St. Peter with keys, St. Catherine with a wheel, were widespread in churches, illuminated manuscripts, and personal devotional objects. These images served as reminders of holy figures and their intercessory power, guiding the faithful and promoting specific religious cults. The Virgin Mary, often depicted with the infant Jesus, symbolized purity, compassion, and divine motherhood, inspiring widespread devotion. These religious symbols were not just abstract concepts. They were believed to embody spiritual power and protection, influencing daily life and shaping moral conduct. The very act of making the sign of the cross was a powerful symbolic gesture of faith and protection. Royal regalia were objects imbued with profound symbolic meaning. Crown, scepter, and orb used in coronation ceremonies were not just fancy accessories. The crown symbolized supreme temporal authority, often decorated with jewels and precious metals to convey wealth and grandeur. The scepter represented justice and divine guidance. The orb, surmounted by a cross, symbolized the Christian world, ruled by the monarch under God. These objects were often believed to be touched by divine power, reinforcing the idea of the monarch's divine right to rule. The very act of the king holding these objects during a public ceremony, or their depiction in portraits and on seals, visually communicated his sacred and undisputed authority. The king's throne itself, often elevated and ornate, symbolized his elevated status and centrality to the kingdom. Guilds, powerful associations of craftsmen and merchants in medieval towns, also employed their own iconography. Each guild had its specific symbols, often tools of their trade or images related to their craft which they displayed on their banners in their guild halls and during public processions. For example, a baker's guild might use a sheaf of wheat, while a mason's guild might use a compass and square. These symbols fostered a strong sense of collective identity, pride in their profession, and solidarity among guild members. They also publicly asserted the guild's economic power and social standing within the urban community. Seeing these symbols during religious festivals or civic parades would have reinforced the social order and the importance of each craft to the city's prosperity. Banners and flags were critical in warfare and public display. A military banner was more than just a piece of cloth. It was the rallying point for an army, embodying the honor of the lord or king it represented. Losing a banner in battle was a deeply humiliating blow, signifying defeat and disgrace. Conversely, capturing an enemy banner was a great triumph. The banner of the Holy Roman Empire, featuring a black eagle on a gold field, represented the power and continuity of the imperial dynasty. Royal standards, often large and elaborately embroidered, declared the sovereign's presence and authority. During tournaments, the display of heraldic banners created a colorful and symbolic spectacle, reinforcing the hierarchy of nobility. The raising of a banner over a newly captured castle signaled its change of ownership and the new authority in charge. From the smallest coin to the tallest cathedral, medieval society was saturated with a visual language of power and belief. These symbols were constantly present, shaping perceptions, inspiring loyalty, and reinforcing the social and political order. They were not merely decorative. They were deliberate and potent means of communication, ensuring that messages about authority, faith, and identity reached everyone, regardless of their ability to read. Number 2. Ritual and pageantry. Medieval life was deeply structured by elaborate rituals and public pageantry. These were not simply formal procedures. They were carefully choreographed performances designed to reinforce social hierarchies, legitimize authority, and instill a sense of order and shared identity. Every significant event, from coronations to knightings, from judicial proceedings to religious processions, was transformed into a spectacle intended to communicate power and meaning to all who witnessed it. Coronation ceremonies were the pinnacle of royal pageantry. When a new king ascended to the throne, the coronation was much more than a simple transfer of power. It was a sacred ritual, often taking place in a magnificent cathedral, such as Westminster Abbey for English kings or Reims Cathedral for French kings. The entire ceremony was designed to visually and emotionally impress upon all present the divine right of the monarch. The king would be anointed with holy oil, a ritual with biblical precedents, emphasizing his selection by God. He would then be crowned with the regalia, the crown, scepter, and orb, each item imbued with symbolic meaning. The acclamation of the people shouting "Vivat Rex, long live the king," was a crucial part of the performance, demonstrating popular consent. The archbishop or bishop presiding over the ceremony lent the church's immense spiritual authority to the monarch's reign. The grand procession to and from the cathedral, with nobles, clergy, and members of the royal court dressed in their finest attire, showcased the wealth and power of the realm. The sight of the new king solemnly crowned and blessed confirmed his legitimacy in the eyes of his subjects, both noble and common. The meticulous staging of these events left no doubt about the sacred and absolute nature of royal authority. For example, the coronation of William the Conqueror on Christmas Day 1066 at Westminster Abbey, despite the violent circumstances of his arrival, was a meticulously planned ceremony aiming to project continuity and divine approval for his new reign. Knighting ceremonies were rituals that marked the transition of a young noble into the warrior class, bound by oaths of loyalty and codes of chivalry. The ceremony, often involving a vigil, a bath of purification, and the donning of armor, culminated in the dubbing, the striking of the sword on the knight's shoulder. This public act formally recognized the knight's status, responsibilities, and allegiance to his lord. It instilled a sense of pride and belonging in the knight, and showcased the hierarchical structure of feudal society. These ceremonies underscored the military might of the nobility and their role in defending the realm, solidifying the bonds between lords and their vassals. The solemnity and gravity of the ritual emphasized the weight of the oaths being taken. Religious processions and feast days were powerful expressions of communal belief and social order. On major feast days, such as Easter or the feast of a patron saint, the entire community would participate in solemn processions. Clergy, carrying relics, crosses, and banners, would lead the congregation through the streets, often pausing at various shrines or altars. These processions were not just spiritual acts, they were public demonstrations of piety, unity, and adherence to the Church's authority. The display of precious relics believed to hold miraculous powers inspired awe and devotion. The organized participation of guilds, each with their own banners and distinctive attire, reinforced their social standing and their place within the civic and religious fabric of the town. These communal rituals fostered a strong sense of shared identity and belonging, reaffirming the prevailing religious and social order. The sight of the entire community, from the humblest peasant to the wealthiest merchant, marching together in shared devotion, created a powerful sense of unity under the Church's guidance. Judicial proceedings, especially public trials and executions, were grim forms of pageantry. Public sentencing of criminals or rebels, often followed by their execution in the town square, was a stark demonstration of the lord's or king's power to maintain law and order. The scaffold became a stage, and the executioner an instrument of the ruler's justice. The purpose was not just punishment, but deterrence. Witnessing the grim fate of those who defied authority served as a powerful warning to the populace, reinforcing the consequences of disobedience. The meticulous formal procedures of a trial, even if the outcome was predetermined, gave an appearance of justice and legitimacy to the ruler's power. For example, the public burning of heretics, such as Jan Hus in 1415, was a calculated spectacle by the church and secular powers to demonstrate their intolerance for dissent and their unwavering authority over spiritual and temporal matters. Feudal homage ceremonies where a vassal swore an oath of loyalty to his lord were deeply symbolic rituals that cemented the bonds of medieval society. The vassal would kneel before his lord, place his hands within the lord's, and declare himself his man. This act of submission and the subsequent kiss of peace symbolized the personal and reciprocal relationship between lord and vassal. The ceremony, often witnessed by other nobles, publicly established the hierarchy and the mutual obligations that underpinned the feudal system. The solemnity of the oath, often sworn on holy relics or a Bible, reinforced its sacred and binding nature. These rituals were essential for maintaining the intricate web of alliances and loyalties that governed medieval kingdoms. Each of these rituals and pageants, regardless of their specific purpose, shared a common goal: to create a powerful interistic experience that communicated specific messages about power, legitimacy, and social order. They were designed to appeal to the senses and emotions, leaving a lasting impression on the minds of those who witnessed them. By making authority visible, tangible, and emotionally resonant, medieval rulers and religious institutions maintained control and fostered loyalty in an age without widespread literacy. The sheer repetition and cultural embedding of these ritualistic performances ensured their enduring impact on the collective consciousness. Number 1. Religious justification and divine mandate. In the medieval world, the most potent claim to authority was that of divine mandate. Rulers from kings to emperors and the church itself asserted that their power stemmed directly from God. This religious justification transformed secular rule into a sacred trust, making disobedience not just an act of rebellion against a king, but a sin against God. This belief permeated every aspect of medieval society, providing an unassailable foundation for authority. The concept of the divine right of kings, though fully articulated later, had deep roots in the medieval period. Kings were seen as God's chosen representatives on earth, ruling by His grace. This idea was powerfully reinforced through coronations, where monarchs were anointed with holy oil by senior clergy, mirroring the anointing of biblical kings. This ritual sacralized the king's person, making him untouchable and his rule legitimate. For example, Charlemagne's coronation as Holy Roman Emperor by Pope Leo III on Christmas Day, 800, was a pivotal moment. While debated whether Charlemagne fully anticipated the papal act, the event was widely interpreted as the Pope bestowing imperial authority upon him, thereby linking the renewal of the Roman Empire to divine will and papal sanction. This established a precedent that would influence the relationship between spiritual and temporal powers for centuries, with both sides leveraging the idea of divine approval. King's body itself was considered sacred, often leading to beliefs in their ability to perform miracles, such as the king's touch, curing scrofula, a disease of the neck. This further elevated the monarch beyond ordinary mortals. The Church, as the intermediary between God and humanity, wielded immense power through its ability to grant or withhold divine legitimacy. Popes could excommunicate rulers effectively, releasing their subjects from oaths of loyalty and potentially leading to civil war, as seen in the investiture controversy between Pope Gregory VII and Emperor Henry IV. Gregory's assertion of papal supremacy included the power to depose emperors, framing it as God's will. Conversely, the Church could endorse a ruler offering its spiritual blessings for military campaigns or political actions. The Crusades provide a dramatic illustration of this. Pope Urban II, at the Council of Clermont in 1095, called for the First Crusade, promising spiritual rewards, remission of sins, to those who took up the cross. He framed the military expedition to reclaim Jerusalem as a divinely ordained mission, a holy war against infidels. This religious justification motivated hundreds of thousands of people, from knights to commoners, to embark on a perilous journey to the Holy Land. Call to arms was preached across Europe by fervent orators, appealing directly to people's faith and desire for salvation. The banner of the cross became a powerful symbol, making the fight not just about land, but about fulfilling God's will. Wars and conflicts were frequently justified as divinely sanctioned. Kings would invoke God's name before battle, claiming that their cause was just and that God was on their side. When William the Conqueror invaded England, he famously secured the blessing of Pope Alexander II, who sent him a papal banner. This papal support was a powerful propaganda tool, signaling that William's invasion was not merely a conquest but a righteous endeavor, and Harold Godwinson, the English king, was a usurper going against divine will. Similarly, Spanish kings during the Reconquista framed their centuries-long struggle against Muslim rule in Iberia as a holy crusade to reclaim Christian lands, invoking the protection of St. James Matamoros, Moor Slayer. This religious framing transformed territorial ambitions into sacred duties, making it easier to rally support and maintain morale over long periods of conflict. Military victories were often attributed to divine intervention, further solidifying the belief that the ruler enjoyed God's favor. Religious texts and narratives played a crucial role in reinforcing divine mandate. Monastic scribes copied biblical passages and patristic writings that emphasized obedience to secular and ecclesiastical authority as obedience to God. Sermons regularly reminded congregations of their duty to obey their rulers, as all authority ultimately derived from God. The story of Adam and Eve and the concept of original sin reinforced the idea of a fallen world in need of divine guidance, channeled through the church and righteous rulers. Chroniclers often wove religious interpretations into their historical accounts, portraying successful rulers as pious and divinely favored, while those who faced misfortune were depicted as having incurred God's wrath due to their sins. This historical framing further solidified the idea that God actively intervened in human affairs, endorsing legitimate rule and punishing transgression. The concept of universal dominion, often associated with the Holy Roman emperors, was another expression of divine mandate. Emperors like Otto I in the 10th century and Frederick Barbarossa in the 12th century saw themselves as successors to the Roman emperors and defenders of Christendom, with a universal mission to govern all Christians under God's ultimate authority. Their titles and imperial regalia were designed to reflect this exalted status, positioning them as paramount rulers chosen by God to maintain order in the Christian world. This claim often put them at odds with the papacy, leading to power struggles, but the underlying premise of divine approval remained central to both sides' arguments. Religious justification provided an unshakable foundation for medieval power structures. It infused secular authority with sacred meaning, making it difficult for ordinary people to challenge. By positioning themselves as instruments of God's will, rulers and the church created a powerful narrative that commanded obedience, inspired loyalty, and shaped the entire worldview of medieval society. This ultimate appeal to divine authority was the most effective and pervasive form of propaganda in an age defined by profound faith.